Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everybody, those who've been here all day for a workshop, and the students and additional people in. I think we're in for a treat today with our speaker, Dan Parolek. Had two bios for Dan, one's a short and one's a long, and he prefers the short one, but his parents are here, so I thought they might like to hear the long version, but we'll keep it to the short, and welcome for joining us as well. Dan Parolek is an architect and urban designer who has grown the company he founded into nationally sought after thought leaders in urban placemaking, innovative housing design and policy, and urban reform, or zoning reform, excuse me. He has been covered in many high-profile publications, including New York Times, Washington Post, Next City, Curbed Magazine, Urban Land, and Professional Builder Magazine. He created the concept and championed the now international movement of missing middle housing. He co-authored a book, Form-Based Codes, which Planitson, I can never pronounce that correctly, called one of the top 10 planning books of 2007. And he co-founded the nonprofit think tank, the Form-Based Code Institute. His work has won a diverse range of awards, including American Planning Association's Burnham Prize, Congress for New Urbanism's Charter Award Grand Prize, and Gold Nugget Awards. His knowledge and foresight makes him a valuable partner advisor for cities and developers across the country who are striving to respond to the demand for vibrant urban living. Prior to joining Opticos, Daniel worked with Robert A.M. Stern in New York City, working with a broad range of projects from professional baseball stadium to homes for the likes of Michael Eisner and John Bon Jovi. Daniel has a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame, a Master of Urban Design from the University of California at Berkeley. He loves to travel internationally, particularly in Italy. And the other fact I want to throw on is Dan gained his love for well-planned and urban settings from riding his bike around the city of Columbus, Nebraska, where he grew up. So we're happy to have him and welcome him back to Nebraska. Please help me give him a warm welcome back to town.
Well, good afternoon. I created the concept of missing middle housing now a few years ago to address two concerns that I had seen through the course of the 15 plus years of our practice. Number one is the tremendous gap between the types of housing and the types of places that people want to live and what the development industry was delivering, right? We all across the country, whether it be in an Iowa city or a big city like Austin, we saw this growing gap. Buyers just were not, or renters were not being delivered the types of housing they wanted. Second of all is there's a housing affordability crisis pretty much every city in the country. If you had told me even 3 or 4 years ago that my hometown of Columbus, Nebraska was going to be having very sort of thoughtful discussions about delivering affordable housing for the workforce there, I think I would have actually laughed. Because the thought of sort of the affordable housing conversation trickling down all the way to small cities is a challenge that we see all across the country, and it's growing. And so I felt that this concept, as a very starting point, can help communities have a conversation about the need for these choices, but it can also introduce tools into their toolbox, into their regulations, in terms of changes that they can make to remove barriers to deliver these range of housing choices. Just say if you are into Twitter, this is my Twitter feed, and that's a hashtag that I encourage you to use if anything of interest comes up to you. So I was recently doing research for a book that I'm wrapping up for Island Press on missing middle housing. And I was looking at the Chicago 2 flat. Right, this is a photo I just took this past weekend in Chicago. And I came across a series of really neat stories about how in the early 1900s, The immigrants were moving into Chicago, a lot of them Bohemians, maybe even some of them your ancestors who made their way then on to Nebraska. And they were living in tenements. And they wanted to improve the quality of their life, so they worked hard, they saved up money, and sometimes it took a little bit of luck, where they could actually buy or build one of these 2 flats. So what this is it's a ground floor unit with the second unit just simply stacked above it. They could afford to buy one of these 2 flats to establish economic stability for their household and to help them move up the social ladder. And the reason that that was possible because the rent from that second unit that they got helped them pay their mortgage. So right, we don't deliver housing in this way, and we don't provide this opportunity for people. So there's a lot of lessons learned here in terms of how a type like this 2 flat or any of these other missing middle types I'm going to talk about can help think more creatively about delivering more attainable and affordable housing choices, but it's also thinking about how we can deliver more choices to the market that's looking for more walkable living. So I'd like to start out by framing why is this a problem? Why is this so important for us to be talking about? Some of these statistics actually still shock me today when I go through them. So 1 out of every 3 households has 1 person in it. Now, do you think, as a planner and architect, decision maker, do we think that 1/3 of the housing that's being delivered in a market has been designed and built specifically for the needs of a single person household? Absolutely not. I mean, if you go on to Redfin or Trulia, I'm often like when I'm traveling, sort of look what's for sale or for rent in a market, I can guarantee there's like very, very little housing being sort of built specifically for that need. By 2025, up to 85% of households will not have children. Once again, think of the impact that will have on the types of housing that we need to be delivering. We're not delivering housing to meet that needs. By 2030, 1 out of every 5 households will be over the age of 65. Once again, even just simply a set of steps going up to a porch into a unit all of a sudden become a challenge for a large percentage of people looking for a new home. And also, right, there's the shifting face of the majority, right? Between 2005 and 2050, 60% of the growth will be accountable to a growing Latino population. Now, we were doing a project recently in Central California. It was a public charrette process. And we heard very strongly from the Latino community in this city is they choose culturally to live multi-generational. That's a choice that they make because that's part of their culture. But they had to buy a sort of generic single-family detached house because that was all that was being delivered in their market. So once again, what do all these sort of changes in household demographics mean in terms of informing the type of housing we are designing, planning for, writing zoning codes for, and all other sorts of regulations as these shifts continue to make an impact on household demographics? So the 2 biggest market segments are the baby boomers between ages 55 and 64, and the millennials, which are between the age of 25 and 34. 2/3 of the millennials' households want to live in a walkable urban context. Right? That's a dramatic shift in demand. Now, 1/3 of the baby boomers also want that type of walkability. And what I would say is there's a tremendous amount of research that's been done, a lot of it through the Brookings Institute and Chris Lineberger, that's shown that in most markets, only 10% of the housing that is on the market is actually in a walkable urban context. So I'm not an economist, but it's a pretty basic economic equation of high demand and low supply equals high housing costs, right? It's that simple. We're not shifting to meet the needs of this growing demand for walkable urban living. And what's interesting about this is if you look at this, 34% of this in the millennials is missing middle housing scale. It's not necessarily, there's proportions of both of these market segments that want to live right in downtown in that 7-story, 12-story big condo or apartment building, but there's a pretty big percentage that wants what we call neighborhood scale. So there's a real sweet spot here for the missing middle housing that's not being met. Right, this is tying back to that affordable housing issue, right? This is from the American Housing Survey that in 2017, over a third of American households were housing cost burdened. And what that means is those households are spending over 1/3 of their income just on housing. And that's actually a really tough position to be in as a household. And what's even worse is if you take the transportation costs and add them to those housing costs, a lot of these households are spending over 50% of their annual incomes on housing and transportation. So that's a really big a stretch for these American households and a lot of economic instability. The last issue that I like to talk about and a lot of our work is focused on is related to zoning reform and the fact that we're working with an antiquated, out-of-date zoning system that is almost 100 years old and that has undergone very few changes. And these zoning codes can't tell the difference between this apartment building and that apartment building. And that's a big problem. I can say that I wandered through the neighborhood just south of the Capitol here in Lincoln, and Lincoln got a lot of this in the 1960s, 70s, and probably through the early 80s. And it really turned a lot of Americans and sort of communities off to the concept of apartments, to multifamily, and even this density term that we like to use a lot that I encourage cities to stop using. But, right, these two buildings are the same height, they're the same setback, and they are the same density. But I think all of you would agree that there's one of those buildings you wouldn't mind having as a neighbor, and there's another one that you would kick and scream to not allow in your neighborhood. So, right, we need to fix our zoning system to address this. If I handed you a camera from 1930, which is when zoning was created, and said, hey, let's take a selfie and either email this, Twitter this, Snapchat it to our group of friends, would you think I was a little bit ridiculous, right? Absolutely. So this is one of my sort of bandwagons, is that we're using an out-of-date operating system with our zoning that we need to step back and completely rethink to enable true full range of housing choices. Oh, sorry, I forgot I put this in here last minute, right? This is what our communities are afraid of when the planners come in, the developer comes in, or the architect comes in and said, hey, we're gonna build a multifamily project in your neighborhood. Like, these are the worst case examples that are what come to most community members' minds when we think about this. So a big role of missing middle housing is to frame this conversation in a way where we can actually build support in our communities for the need for these diverse housing choices. So what is missing middle housing? On the left-hand side of the diagram, in white, are single-family detached houses. I think you would all agree, right? We've done a great job with our planning, our zoning, our financial systems, our building delivery systems, and we know how to deliver single-family homes, right? Unfortunately, we can't slow it down, and it just keeps delivering when there's not actually a need for it. On your right-hand side are the 5, 6, 7+ story, either mixed-use buildings or apartments or condos that, in particular in the last 15 to 20 years, in pretty much every market across the country, right, cities have figured it out with their planning and zoning, developers have figured it out, banks have figured out how to finance it. But it's all of these types in the middle the duplex, the fourplex, the bungalow court, the courtyard building that exist in every single neighborhood built in the United States prior to 1940, but we stopped building them for a large number of reasons, but that's why we call them missing. But they are an important part of a response to these two big housing issues. If you're gonna leave sort of today with one idea, is that missing middle they're house scale buildings that just happen to have multiple units in it. That's a really easy concept for people to understand, because there's a notion that if you add more units to a building, that the building needs to get bigger. But this is countering that and saying, hey, you can still have a house scale building, might have 3, 4, 5 units inside of it. And I'll show you some examples in a little bit. So the conversation about missing middle housing a lot of times defaults immediately to middle income. And I would say that's absolutely an important part of it, but first and foremost, this conversation about missing middle housing needs to be about form and scale, because there's a need for this housing for middle income households, but there's also a growing interest and demand for these housing types at upper ends of the market segments. And some of the most successful development projects that we have worked on with clients have targeted sort of the upper end of markets for missing middle housing, because there's almost nobody building higher end, smaller, walkable urban units across the country. And then secondarily, right, they can deliver affordability by design. And let me talk a little bit more about that. Oh, sorry, house scale. If you drove by this building, would you ever guess that this wasn't just a large single-family home? Right? No, you wouldn't, and that's the whole concept here. This is actually 3 units. It's just contained in a building that looks and feels and acts and behaves like a single-family detached house. And on this barbell of affordable housing, right, all of these responses are important, right? We need subsidized affordable housing, right? That's affordability with a capital A. We need to find federal subsidies, local subsidies. On the right-hand side of the barbell, we also need to just remove some of the barriers that are in place to deliver more housing of all different types. And right here in the middle of this is the missing middle. And what's great about the missing middle, and some of the examples I'll show in a little bit will show this, is that they can be delivered affordable by design without any sort of subsidy, because they're simple buildings. If a developer is really smart about it, they can deliver them very efficiently, very compact footprint, and basically smaller units. And a lot of times they are being built by smaller local builders who aren't trying to achieve as high of a return on the project. And so we found on projects across the country that there's a really good sweet spot, and it's usually about 60% of median income, households that have 60% median income or above, that you can deliver missing middle housing for, and anything below that will typically take some sort of subsidy to accommodate. So why do we call it missing? I mean, this is pretty, if you look at this, less than 10% of the units between 1990 and 2013 that were built were missing middle housing scale. And this is just information from the National Housing Survey. Really easy information to dig up, right? So, right, they are missing. We're just not building them. We need to think about this. I use this because this is Omaha. And the other reason that a lot of this missing middle housing is missing is because we tore it down as a part of the urban renewal efforts in the 1950s and 60s. And this is the 75 freeway in Omaha that basically ripped this scar between downtown and midtown Omaha. And I can guarantee you, because there's like little remnants of beautiful historic missing middle buildings on the edges of this freeway, and I know even some of Jerry Reimer's projects are just on the midtown side, a lot of cities actually tore a lot of their historic missing middle fabric down as part of their strategy to either sort of put these ring roads around the city or just part of their urban renewal strategies. It's actually quite tragic in a lot of examples. All right, parking. How many of you have ever been part of a contentious discussion in a community about trying to reduce parking requirements on a site? This always comes up, and this is a Banksy street art graphic from LA, and I like to use this to just get people to realize we need to be thinking more creatively about how we approach parking. And I'll say that a couple of messages that I like to send is, I would say every American city has done a better job delivering spaces for cars than they have places for people to live. Period. There's not a single city in the country that can sort of counter that. The second point I like to make is if a city doesn't reduce their parking requirements, they are not going to get missing middle housing. It's just not physically possible to fit it on small enough sites. And it also at some point doesn't make economic sense in terms of reduction in program and impact on the pro forma. And so I just encourage cities to think creatively about this, knowing it's going to be a contentious conversation, start that conversation early, and even if it takes a couple years to get to a good point, at least you've started it straight on. So just some examples, right? These are some of the great examples that I found in Lincoln, including I wouldn't have expected to find a cottage court in Lincoln, but it's kind of its own sort of regional version here. That was just, I think it was Washington Street, just south of downtown here. Big cities have missing middle. Let's say I've been to Detroit a handful of times in the last 4 to 5 years. The neighborhoods that are doing best in Detroit are the ones that have a really great mix of the missing middle housing types. And they're being revitalized in a really great way. Smaller towns like Winston-Salem, you can see some similarities here. The types actually repeat in these different cities, but the architectural vocabulary changes in each of these places. Omaha has a great mix of these types. And then New Orleans. And I like to end with this slide because what this demonstrates, once again, it reinforces the fact that there's a shared palette of missing middle across all these cities, the fourplex, the duplex, townhouse. But the types adapt based on the local climate and the culture. And just some really simple elements like this really deep overhang. It looks really good, but it's also functional because it shades that facade to the point where it's actively or passively cooling the building in the summer. It also allows the person inside of that home to lower that top sash, even when it's sort of pouring rain in the middle of the summer to get cross ventilation. Without the rain, it blocks the rain from coming in that top sash. So just some really basic green building concepts that were inherent in local adaptations of these types. And then just a quick overview of these types. I encourage cities or planners that are discussing missing middle to not use density. I call it the scary D word. If you walk into a neighborhood and say, we're gonna increase the density in your neighborhood, how many of you think that you're gonna build support from a community in that way? Yeah, absolutely not. But I do like to show what types of densities that these types generate as an output on typical lot sizes, just so that planners and developers can think about sort of which of these types might make sense for them. So a side-by-side duplex, it's just 2 units side-by-side, generates about 20 units per acre typically. This is a stacked duplex, or 2-flat as they call in Chicago. This is a Omaha example. It's basically a ground floor unit that this door goes into, and you go out to that door, up a set of stairs, and there's another unit on top. It's a pretty basic type. Once again, about 20 units per acre. The cottage court, I think this is a wonderful type, and there's actually, of all the types, there's newly constructed cottage courts that are happening. It's just a series of small cottages, usually under 1,000 square feet, oriented around a shared green space. And we found historic examples of these types that can actually generate densities of up to 35 units per acre. So if you're if you sort of know what density sort of parameters are, that's actually getting pretty high, especially for single-story building types. The fourplex, this is my favorite. Simply two units on the ground floor and then 2 units stacked above it. There are versions of this, like this one from the Bishop Arts neighborhood in Dallas, that share a single door. So if you go by it, you don't ever notice that there's 4 units in it. Looks very much like a single-family house. Or a local version here that I saw that, right, almost the exact same form, except it has 4 separate doors. And there's benefits to either one of those. And these generate of densities of sort of, once again, sort of the mid to low 30 units per acre. And we've done a series of studies as we've researched the missing middle types, and these are 1-bedroom units in a fourplex, and these are a fourplex with 2-bedroom units to show the impact of parking. If you do a fourplex without on-site parking, it can generate 50 units per acre. The exact same building, front-loaded with 1 space per unit, drops down to 23 units per acre. Exact same building. So you can see this is partly why density is a completely ineffective way to regulate for a predictable outcome. Townhouses, I think that's pretty straightforward, but they vary regionally. And then courtyard buildings. And a lot of times people's vision of courtyard is like that beautiful Spanish Revival courtyard building, but there's really amazing examples in pretty much every city we've seen. I think both of these are from Omaha, and I think Urban Village owns one of them. And then there's a multiplex medium. It's like we typically say that missing middle stops at 2.5 stories, but we need to be thinking about this upper spectrum of missing middle that goes up to 3 or 4, but we call that upper missing middle. So you have to be really careful about differentiating in conversations with your community members. So how are builders using missing middle housing? And so, I can guarantee, whatever city you work in or live in, if you go to the development community and say, especially those building single-family homes, and say, well, we're going to change our regulations so when you create a planned community, there's a percentage of that needs to be missing middle housing. And they're going to be like, no way, there's no market for this. It's not going to work financially. Number one, I can guarantee there is market for it. And number two, if they're smart about it, they can actually deliver higher per square foot returns than way higher square foot returns than their single family homes. One of the biggest builders in Salt Lake City called us about 3 years ago. We're not a type of firm that typically works for big production builders, but we said, hey, this is our opportunity to have an impact at a big scale. He bought 7 acres within a larger master plan community. He had 2 challenges. This was Spencer Holmes. The company was Holmes Homes, so it was his family business. He said, our business is based on the model of delivering suburban single-family homes. I'm smart enough to understand the market is shifting and the market wants other types of housing, but I have no idea what to do, how to respond to that. He said, the second challenge is we've dabbled in building townhouses, like they did some kind of townhouses with parking on the ground floor. He said, but prices have gone up so much in the last 2 years that I can't build and sell a townhouse at a price point that an entry-level buyer can buy. And so he's like, can missing middle help us? So we delivered this product, which we call the Muse Homes. And what I like about this is let me get to this is the pedestrian-only Muse. So that there are units that face onto this pedestrian way, and then there's other units that face onto the exterior streets of the blocks. And so what's interesting about this is we were delivered these 2 big blocks, and we split the 2 blocks each into 4 micro blocks, so that these conventional townhouses oriented toward the street, there was a shared alley. And then these orange buildings are the Muse houses that have an address, a really high quality address on that interior pedestrian Muse. And so what we basically did is we took a townhouse that is typically narrow along the street and sort of deep into the lot, and we flipped it on its side so that you get natural light on the long side as opposed to the shallow side. And so the market responded to this. The units range from just a little under 1,000 square feet to about 1,500 square feet. And by this market standards, that's actually quite small. And what was interesting about this is our client was able to sell these at a price point about $35,000 less than their conventional townhouse units. And they started at a price point of $185,000, and nobody in that market was able to get below $200,000 price point, and then they went up to $220,000 in that first phase. So a really interesting sort of success story about how a large production builder, single-family builder used missing middle to diversify their portfolio and deliver really high-quality housing at an attainable price point. So this is the space that you walk into. It's like a double-story lofted space. This has actually been a very successful project, not only for the developer, but it's gotten a lot of, it's won a Gold Nugget Award, and it's been published in Professional Builder. So we're really excited that there's interest in learning from this particular project. The second project I want to talk about is a local project, and we actually just had a panel on this project, so I apologize if there's a little bit of overlap, but this project, Prairie Queen or Urban Waters, it sort of goes by two names, but this was developed by Urban Village in Papillion, Nebraska. So this is the country's first complete missing middle neighborhood. And I'm actually really super excited that this is happening in Nebraska, just having roots here, and thrilled that I was able to connect with Jerry to collaborate on this project. Very simple concept. And I think this sketch, people respond to this sketch like immediately. The idea was you have a building that looks like a big house. One of these big estate houses that were in Dundee, or the neighborhood that's just to the west of Dundee, but instead of this being a mansion, one single unit, this building has 7 units in it, right? You can't tell from the street. It looks like a mansion. So that was the real premise behind this. Sort of the very start of this project. And so it's 618 units on 40 acres. It's planned around a street and block framework. And it delivers a bit of, well, I'll talk about the walkability in a little bit. But you notice here that this is not a homogeneous pattern of the same building or even a couple buildings, but there's a really nice variety in the scale and the size of the buildings, and this will be reflected in some of the photos you see. The other really interesting aspect of this project is we worked really closely with Jerry early on in this process to define a set of about 6 or 7 unit plans. So if you think about each one of those colors representing a unit plan, and then we put those same units together in different configurations to create a variety of different types ranging from a duplex up to an 8-plex. To get that variety. And so Jerry and Urban Village gets their efficiencies by sort of repeating those units in the different buildings. So phase 1 is complete. They're sort of very rapidly jumping into phase 2. I think phase 2 is 90 units, approximately 90 units. But right, this is the 5-plex. There's a 4-plex and a 6-plex on the same street here. And these are the live-work units that are on the edge of the project that define the little neighborhood main street of sorts. And I was just sort of recently talking to Jerry about this, and what's really neat about this is the social diversity and sort of household incomes different household incomes that live in this is, there are 1-bedroom apartments on the bottom of that 4-plex that start, I think, just a little under $1,000 a month. And then there's doctors renting that 2-story townhouse for $3,000 a month. And they live on the same block, right? And that just doesn't happen in suburban context anymore. And so there's a really interesting social dynamic to this project. I will say that back to the parking conversation, is that this project would not be possible if Jerry wasn't open-minded to being okay with one off-street parking space per unit. You can see the alley there and the garages. And then the second parking space per unit happens on this pedestrian scaled street. And also kudos to the city of Papillion for collaborating with Jerry on this and sort of getting through some of the details that were challenging from an engineering and sort of regulatory standpoint. So really neat project. We're super excited about it. Once again, there's nothing like this. This is really going to shake up the multifamily industry, and I think it's kind of starting locally here. There's a lot of interest in it, and I think nationally it's even going to shake up the way that developers think about this. The third project is one that we were super excited to work on. We collaborated with Prince Charles has a community building foundation, and we were asked, I think it was starting in 2013, to collaborate with them on a sustainable growth strategy for Libreville, which is the capital of Gabon, Africa. And this is just the final plan and some of the imageries, but the reason I brought this up here is that missing middle was even a core of this project, of how can you deliver a range of housing choices that have adapted and are very specific to the tropical context of Gabon. And this is a side yard house on the left, and what we just call this a flex house on the right. And we partnered, just got to give credit where credit's due here, a really amazing architect out of Panama City, Panama called Chrysolis, and their expertise was tropical building design. And so our interest in expertise in housing types and their expertise in tropical design produced these concepts. And we had to think very thoughtfully about how these types adapted to this tropical climate, passive cooling, cross ventilation, shading, sort of shielding the windows from rain, just some really interesting things that we had never had to deal with before. But I like that this one building can actually have various different configurations without changing at all in form. So there can be 6 apartments, 2 on the ground floor main building, 1 in the ancillary building, and then up above it can be two apartments and another one stacked on top. It can be 2 apartments on the top floor and in the upper floor of the back, and 2 office spaces on the ground floor. And then it can also just be one really big villa. And so there's a lot of flexibility in how this type gets integrated into this master plan. And we actually we wrote this country's first zoning code. And these types were embedded in that zoning code. And then we're also just recently worked on a really cool project responding to the Northern California fires and Sonoma habitat, where we developed a small cluster of cottages using a variety of different building systems. We did SIPS panels, we did modular, we did a couple of their systems like Gigacrete, and we tested which systems could actually deliver on cost and time. And the ones that were able to deliver were built on this pilot site, but the idea is that they're going to be used to build throughout Sonoma County to deliver housing, much needed housing for the victims of the fires in California. And that was last year's fires, unfortunately. There's even more fire this year. Okay, as I transition into some public sector thoughts, is back to this thought concept of density, is the best thing to do to get people talking about missing middle is to go out on a walking tour. We found this great Courtyard building in Midtown Sacramento on a walking tour about a year ago. Can somebody throw out a density? What's the density number any of the planners or developers in the room think that this might generate? Anybody? 30? Okay, it's a benchmark. That's a pretty good guess. Most people would guess 25 to 30 units per acre. Anybody else? Jerry? Okay, so everybody in our group loved this building. And so we, as a group, went and counted the meters, counted the doorbells. This building generates a density of 90 units per acre, because these are 550 square foot units on a 100 foot by 100 foot lot, no off-street parking. But like this, once again, just sort of debunking this idea that density is a good way to regulate. We've started doing, cities have started asking us to assess their comprehensive plans, assess their small area plans, and assess their zoning codes to identify specific barriers for missing middle housing. Our latest missing middle scan is in Greenville, the city of Greenville and the county of Greenville, South Carolina. And what's really interesting about this is this was actually funded by a group of real estate industry stakeholders. It wasn't funded by the city. It was the development industry and the real estate industry that said, we understand there's a market. Our city systems are barriers. Let's help identify the barriers so the city can fix them. So what's interesting about this is we found at a countywide scale, there were only 2 zoning districts in the entire county that enabled missing middle. And you can't even see that color on the map because it accounts for such a small percentage of the geographic area. So immediately a problem in a place like the Greenville County that's growing pretty rapidly. What we like to do, so that's the city, comparing the densities allowed in the city zoning code, and this is the county zoning code. So these are the zoning districts that we identified as the ones that should be enabling missing middle housing. And this is the density, the maximum densities that these zoning districts allow. And the green bars are the densities that are necessary to allow for each of the missing middle housing types. So you can see that their zoning districts are only enabling a duplex, and they're not allowing enough density to allow a broad range of the missing middle housing type. So there's a huge gap identified in an effort like this, which is not uncommon. It's not uncommon at all. We use the missing middle to inform small area plans. This is a plan we're doing for downtown Davis, California, which is where UC Davis is at. I like this because we created a new way of communicating about form and scale that built support from a city and a community that was very much against anything going bigger than 2 stories. Even though there was an Amtrak station there that went to Sacramento and San Francisco, and the university was there. This very basic concept of small scale form, medium scale form, and large scale. And so we sort of had this conversation and sort of illustrated sort of small, medium, large in the core of their downtown, and we built support for that. And that is actually reflected directly back to the new form-based zoning districts that we created to reinforce this concept of small, medium, and large. And so this neighborhood medium is where this core of missing middle housing is going to be enabled around the perimeter of the downtown. And so we don't have a zoning district that's like RM 150 dash, XXX. It's like we're just saying this is medium scale. We're just getting right to the point of doing that. And then each of the missing middle types, we begin to illustrate. This is a great little courtyard building, missing middle scale, about the different elements of sustainability that the city's policy and the plan we're putting together reinforces for that area. Okay, then there's zoning reform. I think I've talked quite a bit about this, but I just want to continue to. Cities across the country are tackling this issue. If you really know your missing middle metrics, it usually takes me about 10 minutes to find 20 barriers in a city zoning code. Minimum lot sizes are usually too big. Allowed heights usually jump from allowing a 2 or 3 story building up to a 5-story building that's of unlimited size. So the metrics are really wrong in most city zoning codes. We are able to work with the city of Cincinnati over the course of 4 years, one of the largest applications of form-based coding in the country. Within their comprehensive plan, we identified 42 walkable neighborhoods. And then those become the priority application for the new zoning, specifically to enable a broad range of missing middle housing types. And this actually won the Burnham Prize from the National APA, as well as a CNU Charter Award. So this is the zoning district we created. So how many of you feel like this looks like most, any of you have cracked open a zoning code, is this what your zoning code typically looks like? Absolutely not, right? There's a graphic intent image to understand what the intent of the zone is. We just call it neighborhood small footprint. Like that's the intended scale. And then the zone says, instead of saying 50 units per acre max or FAR of 2 max, it just says, here's the full range of missing middle housing types that are allowed in that zone. It just gets right to the point. And this is a really effective way that we've found for enabling missing middle housing types. This has happened in a broad range of different places. Beaufort County, South Carolina. There's a countywide application that we worked on. Kauai County, Austin, Iowa City. So it's not just specific to big cities or the West Coast or the East Coast. This is really happening all over the country. And then this is one of the more exciting projects that we've worked on recently as well. It's South Bend, Indiana, home of my alma mater. Really bombed out neighborhood just northwest of downtown. In a state of decline over the last 30 years. Over half the lots were vacant. And the city asked a really great question. All right, nobody can make economic sense of coming in and buying a house and spending 30 or 40 grand to renovate it because it's only going to be worth about 25 after they even do that. So what if we enabled missing middle housing types? Could that encourage small local builders to come in and start stabilizing and filling the gaps in this neighborhood? And so we worked with a group called the Incremental Development Alliance that ran pro forma analysis of a range of 8 different missing middle types. And it showed that starting at a cottage court with 8 units on a lot, these types started making economic sense even in this really bombed out neighborhood because of its proximity to downtown and another historic neighborhood. So what's interesting about this is 2 partners came to the table. This church decided they wanted to use the lots that they owned around their church to actually sell to their congregation members for affordable housing. And then another group called the Near Northwest Neighborhood Association, which had historically been buying individual houses and renovating them and getting federal subsidies to sell them as affordable housing, decided now that they want to start building multiplexes to help become part of the revitalization of this neighborhood. So it's really exciting to see. And the city actually just last week adopted the changes to the zoning code. So it's about to just happen, and there's 3 local builders that are ready to build. And so a couple of applications more broadly. I just encourage you to look this up. I'm not going to say a lot about it, but the state of Michigan adopted a statewide place-based economic development strategy starting about 8 years ago, and they adopted form-based coding and missing middle housing as 2 of the tools that they decided to use to help implement this economic development strategy. So where they're at now is they did a bunch of training, they sort of targeted opportunity sites. They're now basically working to making sure that local jurisdictions can play an active role in delivering missing middle housing. So they're giving the local jurisdictions a skill set to actually partner with small local builders to build the missing middle housing. So that's pretty exciting. Southeast Australia is having a very vibrant conversation about missing middle housing. They've actually even adopted zoning codes, new zoning codes, specifically called missing middle housing districts. And just encourage you to look up. This is one of the best online interfaces I've ever seen. This is Plan Brisbane. And it's basically an interactive online game. There was a growth scenario. You had to get to 1,000 units by picking from single family detached, missing middle, or sort of mid-rise. And the more single family detached housing you put in your group, the less the affordability sort of meter sort of went slower. Green space got smaller, travel time got bigger. So you could see how the decisions about what kind of growth you wanted to happen would impact all of these outcomes. And I think they got an extremely high number and percentage of community members to engage in this process. So I just encourage you to take a look at it. AARP, if you don't know who they are, 38 million members, used to be the American Association of Retired Persons. They don't like that reference anymore. They have adopted missing middle housing as a core part of their livable communities efforts. And they have hired us and a group of other entities to basically go across the country and educate their membership about the value of walkable living and the value of missing middle housing choices. And I heard from somebody that I think they may have actually been in Omaha yesterday doing one of their livable communities conferences or workshops. And this is, there's a group, I don't know them actually, I just found this when I was doing, it's called Neighbors for More Neighbors. And it probably goes into the kind of that yes in my backyard category type of group, but when I found this, it's like, this is our missing middle diagram. I knew that our message was getting out there and that people were getting creative about this, but it's roses are red, Wohnhöfe are cool. And if you don't know what a Wohnhof is, it's a really great shared street that's found in Europe where the cars and the bikes and pedestrians all mix on the street. It's like, I'm rezoning my heart, it's missing middle is you. So like this gets me really excited about how creative minds and groups are using this concept of missing middle housing. Right, great year for housing policy, really progressive housing policy. The city of Minneapolis early this year basically got rid of single family zoning citywide. Any lot in the entire city you can build 3 units on. So you could convert a big single family house into 3 units, or on a vacant lot you could build 3 units. That's really progressive. I think that's the direction that a lot of places are going. Then the state of Oregon passed this legislation called HB 2001 that eliminates single family zoning statewide. So if you're a developer and you want to develop missing middle housing, Oregon would be a really great place to start your business. So in smaller towns, it goes up to allowing a duplex on any lot. In any city over 25,000, up to 4 units are allowed on any lot in anywhere in the city. So really progressive stuff. If you're interested in learning more about this, I just encourage you to, we launched a free online resource, missingmiddlehousing.com. I just encourage you to go take a look at it. At the time, I decided writing a book was going to take too much time. So putting all of our research online was sort of the easiest way to get it up there. Just encourage you to take a look at it. And I was crazy enough to decide I was going to write a book. Late spring, early summer next year, Island Press will release Missing Middle Housing. I think you can actually pre-purchase it if you're really crazy about missing middle housing and can't wait to get your hands on the book. But back to this, the 2-flat. And once again, it's back to these 2 big housing issues of, number one, affordability. And thinking creatively about how missing middle housing types, much like this 2-flat did in Chicago in the early 1900s, is how can the missing middle housing types deliver a broader range of attainability or affordability in all of our cities across the country. And the second thing, relating this back to this 2-flat, is how can missing middle play a role in delivering that walkability, that walkable urban living that so many households are looking for and they're not being delivered for. And what I like about this photo, this was a slightly different view of the same 2 types, is not only do we have great missing middle, but there's this really interesting shop front building here. Now the shop front's been sort of modified and there's a unit in it, but like this is a sort of organic pattern that happened historically where you could have a small business or a small market or a small cafe right next to these missing middle housing types. And that's sort of the sort of complexity that supports the walkability and creates a walkable urban environment. And so I guess it's just, I'm obviously very passionate about this missing middle housing. It's something that I've been on the road quite a bit the last couple of years, sort of discussing and planting the seeds for conversations. And I think what's great is, regardless of whether you're a planner, an architect, maybe a city leader, general community member, a student aspiring to be any one of those, I think we all really do play a very important role in planting the seeds to help address these really dire housing needs. And I think regardless of where you are in the country, whether you're in a Columbus, Nebraska, or a Lincoln or an Omaha, the market is really waiting for, and I just challenge all of you to step up and play a role in delivering a broader range of housing choices. Thank you. They've asked if you have questions, and I apologize, I went longer than I was supposed to, but I can stick around for questions. You have to come up to the mic, though, to ask your questions. Don't be afraid.
Can you tell us a story about arguing for on-street parking and getting rid of parking lots? We have a project that we're been told we have to have them, and we're arguing against them. We need some ammo.
Tell them to go see Jerry's project in Papillion. No, it's never easy. To be quite honest, I'm really tired of talking about parking. Like what is it about Americans and their parking? Like I think we just need to get beyond it. I think you just need to have a active conversation about it. But you can go, now that you have a great regional example, like there's no reason this can't be done. The market is responding. People are okay parking on the street because they actually can see, they can walk up to their front door and they can see their car outside their front window instead of it being in, and Jerry was talking about this earlier, instead of it being in this autonomous 100-car parking lot quarter of a mile away. Like it's like there's reasons to do that this is a really viable solution. And even detached parking is the other thing. Oh, it snows here. There's no way we can do detached parking. No, well, you might need to get creative. Jerry's doing really cool things like he's building heated garages in phase 2 because there's a market. He found that there's a market for it. So like there's creative, things you can do within a more progressive parking strategy. But yeah, once you have an example, that's the best thing. Go visit it. So, sorry, Jerry, you're going to get lots of visitors in Laura. Yep,
So
Mark.
I have a question about, being involved in the project in Papillion. We had a project where we had high level of trust in the developer. And we had a master developer that was doing the whole project and intended to own the project, very easy to trust. How, as a city, would we approach opening the door, opening up our code to making it easier, more flexible for multiple types of housing within our residential districts, but still having an assurance that the good design will be there?
That's a great question. I think that if you can imagine, for example, a project like Prairie Queen, 40 acres, but instead of Jerry being the builder, Jerry's the master developer, and he's going to sell every single parcel off to somebody else to build that may not share his, like the value he has in the quality of what he's building. So there's a couple of ways that I think this can be done successfully, and I think it's important for cities to be thinking about. I think that we often will propose a review process for each of those phases where a developer comes in very, very early in the process and says, with their architect, with their planner, and says, here's our initial idea. They haven't spent $50,000-$60,000+ yet. They're coming and saying, here's some photo precedents of what we did somewhere else that we want to do here. Here's a quick, conceptual sketch of certain elements of the project, and sort of have a more incremental sort of review process is what we typically propose. And developers don't mind that because even if there's more points of review, they're not sort of racing ahead to potentially be sort of then drawn back where they've spent a bunch of money. So that I encourage as a starting point, like that process being set up for review that's more incremental and sort of starts earlier and requires less for the developer and their team to bring to the table as a starting point. Some cities do choose to do, for example, like architectural guidelines. And I think in some instances, that's at least defining a basic level of quality that is intended is sometimes a good thing to do. Yeah, I mean, I'll tell this story because Mark's the planning director in Papillion, but because of the types of places we often work, we actually submitted a really thick form-based code as part of the mixed-use development agreement. And what was great about Mark, it was just like, he was like, this is too much. And we've never had a city say, this is too much. Like, he's like, we can, let's work together to pare this down so that we can all agree like what we need, like specifically defined in terms of quality control, but let's leave it a little bit more open so that as Jerry goes into first phase and is like, wow, that one thing we thought was gonna work isn't working, there could be a collaboration and sort of a administrative level of review on the city's part. So kudos to the city for that. And Jerry, did you have something to say? So Jerry Reimer is the developer of Prairie Queen. So if you don't know about him, you should find out more about him. Okay. It gets turned off. There you go.
Okay, so there's something I've been trying to persuade Dan to do here, so maybe we can get some business done, okay? But for the developer, every time I have to come and go to each city, or they interpret the rules or the codes here a little different, what just occurred to me is, what if Dan already had plans that met Dan's standards here? So he's, kind of the missing middle, the master of it, and cities were to say, okay, this guy's plans meet these standards. So even though we don't have standards in place, if you'll go use missing middle in Papillion and you want to come do a fourplex in our city and our zoning isn't quite ready yet or this or that, but how do we trust? And it's almost like the good housekeeping seal of approval, right?
Yeah.
So hey, here's a stamp, it's got these key things, and any city starts to accept the fact that these are kind of approved types of designs, I can go to work much faster. The city doesn't have to go re-engineer the whole code book. Just a plug for Dan.
So I've seen cities do this for accessory dwelling units where they have pre-approved plans that you can pull off the shelf, and if you bring that in, like approved. The city of South Bend is actually considering that for the missing middle, because in that type of really challenging economic environment, like you can't pay any architect. Your pro forma, it'll break your pro forma to pay an architect to come in and design a custom building. You really do need something sort of out of a plan book or off the shelf, so to speak. So we are actually talking to them about it. And I think the city of Seattle did a small lot, single family detached, pre-approved set of plans, I do believe as well. So people are thinking about it, but nobody's sort of fully executed on it. I think it's the way that it probably needs to be done, and those might include pre-approved, prefabricated housing types. We've been talking to a handful of different companies that do different type of modular and like kit aparts type of systems to see if we couldn't either just ship the whole building in two pieces or ship a shipping container like the old Sears and Roebuck catalog used to do it. Like we used to do this 100 years ago. Sears and Roebuck used to sell fourplexes, sixplexes, duplexes for, and they would just show up in a container with all the pieces you needed, and that's really what we need to get to. So, yes, Steve.
Yeah, I think this slide is a great slide. This gets into maybe some of the details, but one of the things I like about this slide is the two residential buildings that obviously sit back from the street, the main floor is up from the sidewalk, and then the commercial building, which has been sort of closed in, and then I think this other building probably was more of a commercial building because it's up on the sidewalk. Maybe just talk a minute about it, when you get into some of the details, why some of these issues are important in terms of how the building addresses the street, if you're going to be a residential building versus a commercial building, and so forth.
Yeah, and what I would say is whenever we're thinking about a neighborhood, either planning it or rewriting a zoning code, a lot of city zoning codes change the allowed form based on the use that comes in. And I'm of the mindset that the allowed form should be the same and let the use be flexible in it. So, but right? This does make sense for the shop front to be right at the sidewalk edge. Or a lot of times in a neighborhood like this, well, why not let it set back? We often define a setback zone where it's a maximum of 10 feet back so that you have a dooryard, like maybe a gate, small fence, metal fence or something defining it. So all those details are really important. Even one of the real challenges with this in terms of, we had a conversation the last couple of days about accessibility, right? These would be challenging from an accessibility standpoint. But the closer a residential unit gets to the sidewalk, the higher it wants to be off that sidewalk level for privacy reasons. But you have to counter that with either what's your goal for accessibility or what's the requirement for accessibility. So all those come into play and just need to be very carefully thought out. There's nothing worse than a residential unit at grade that's right at the sidewalk edge. Like, nobody wants to live in that unit, right? Because people are walking by and there's no privacy in that unit. So all those details matter. And even in this instance, like these buildings were built before building code, so even just separation of buildings becomes a thoughtful, something you need to think about. So lots of details. Other questions? Can I make 2 recommendations before everybody takes off? There's one book that everybody in this room needs to read if you haven't read it already. It's The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And it tells a very eye-opening but somewhat depressing story about the racist underpinnings of our zoning system and our housing policy, federal housing policy. I think everybody needs to read it, especially, just read it. Do it. It's really, everybody needs to be familiar with that. The other thing is, I just was thinking about a book called How Buildings Learn. And I'm blanking on the name of the author, but it's a book that's now probably 20 years old. And it talks about how we used to allow these sorts of environments to evolve over time. Like, right, this place allowed the residential unit to get built into the shop front when there wasn't viability. But in 2 more years, when an artist wants to come in and make that their studio, or an architect wants to come in and make that their office, like, that should be allowed. And we just don't allow that sort of flexibility and a little bit of grittiness, I guess, and even potential conflict, or people see as a conflict. And that book talks a lot about like how buildings evolve like that over the course of 10, 15, 20, 50, 75 years. I just encourage you to read those 2 books. Is that it for questions? Great. Well, I'll stick around up here. If you have questions, I'm also happy to give you a business card if you want to follow up with an email. But thanks for coming tonight. It's been a pleasure.